What I'd like to do is take a moment and look at the second set of boxes, but I'm going to go faster than I did on the first ones because I'm retelling the story. As you come back around, I don't want to say, it's more of the same, but it is in a way more of the same. I want you to get some straight talk from God in chapter 4 on His holiness and how He approaches sin. Now we're back at the kind of the condemnation sin part of it. We ended at restoration. So you start in this kind of feeling horrible and you end up feeling good. You start back feeling horrible and you end up feeling good because it's cyclical, okay? And in chapter 4, this is some straight talk. Does the clock run out on do-overs? Does the clock run out on do-overs? That's the question behind chapter 4. And in many, many, many Christian presentations, you will hear the answer no, but the answer is yes. Okay? Because Zoe said so. And because it's in the Bible, which also would be important. Can you tell when the clock's nearly done? Can you tell when you're running out of time? What are the penalties for continually defying God over a long period of time? This is a passage that includes some indictments and some penalties, okay? Indictments are when you land a statement, a charge against someone. Let me give you some quick charges. In verses 1 and 2, just follow as I read it. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a cause against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness, nor kindness, nor knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, deception, murder, stealing, adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. This is a national prescription of a series of indictments. So notice it says, hear what God says about you. You take no firm stand for God. No faithfulness. There is no firm stand. In fact, you show no loyalty to God. In fact, you show no connection to God in your daily walk. Your faithless walk works out in a way that you use your mouth. Now, look at what he says. Deceitful words, you walk deceitfully. Violent words, you're killing. Ill-gotten gain, you're smuggling. Lustful lifestyles, that sexual unfaithfulness. These are all the things that are being built into their culture. Can anybody identify a culture on earth that might be described by this now? Can anybody find a culture on earth that isn't described by this now? In other words, ungodliness prevails in most societies, and it certainly prevailed in their society. Now in verses 3, 4, and 5, look at the chances that are suspended. Someplace next to it, put chances suspended, because this is an important principle you're going to have to come back to. There are things that don't have do-overs. So it says God offers an explanation to those who are feeling cheated when they suffer from their own deeds. He says, verse 3, therefore, because of the way you have acted, therefore the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, the fish of the sea disappear. Yet let no one find fault, let none offer reproof, for your people are like those who contend with the priest. So you will stumble by day, and the prophet also will stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother. Now that sounds like really, sounds bad, but you don't necessarily catch even what he's saying. It sounds like, I'm even going to destroy your mother. He's not talking about your mom. He's talking about the nation. He's talking about the people that gave birth to the ideas of your generation. Here's what he says. Because of the way you've acted, the land has turned against you. The animals have turned against you. You're going to find yourself sick. You're going to find yourself without the means to feed yourself. And then he says, don't let anybody run around shaking their fist at me or their finger at me. I want you to know that you're going to stumble in the daytime, and even the people who have been prophetic, who have been leading you, are going to stumble by night. And eventually I'll collapse your nation. So first you're going to sense a decline. Second, you're going to find somebody else to blame, but that's not the right way to handle it because you're not actually looking at it correctly. And then because of the sin, even those who have made attempts to follow me will suffer because of brash sinners. This is what he says. When a nation goes downhill, it starts off with people at the edges doing what's wrong, but the center of the nation has a moral tenet. Then as time goes on, it starts into a decline. Then people blame everything on the wrong thing. Watch this, because it's what goes on. When judgment comes, even those who have tried to do right will be hurt by the judgment of the nation. When this nation falls apart economically, it'll hurt the churches as well as the people who are outside of them. It'll cut the missions budgets. It'll create toughness in being able to do what God called the church to do. Now, look at the penalties in verses 6 through 19. These are some penalties, and we can sort of spool them off quickly, okay? Penalty number 1, verse 6. Your special blessed position is lost for a time. My people are crushed by the dullness of heart toward me, so I will remove your special status before me for you and your children. In other words, there's a special precious place God puts his people, and he's going to remove that from them because of the way they've allowed the nation to continue to decline. The second penalty that I see is in verse 7, a void of loneliness. With each generation you have longed to live apart from my walk, so I will give you the loneliness that you desire. I will change, the more they've multiplied, the more they sinned against me, I will change their glory into shame, he says. The idea is, since each generation wants less and less of me, I will just remove myself and I will leave you with a void. How about the third penalty? In verse 8, it says, they feed on the sin of my people and direct their desire toward their iniquity. I would say this, proper shame departs from the street. People don't feel ashamed anymore. People hunger to do wrong, but it's shameless. I remember people being embarrassed about pornography. Now people walk around and talk about it like two guys sitting there boasting about what they were watching the night before. It's pretty amazing to see a change from where I sit to the way people are very shameless about what they do. I had a person not long ago share with me, I'm really good at marriage. I've done it 4 times. I remember when you would be ashamed to say that. Now people, it's like a badge of honor. I know how to get divorced and survive. Like, that's a good thing. Here's the thing. In verse 9 it says that, and it will be like people, like priests. So I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. What does that mean? It will be like people, like priests. That sounds backwards, doesn't it? It will be like people, like spiritual leaders. The spiritual leaders of this country grew up in this country. So, in other words, as you change the morality of the country, the spiritual leaders decline and change because they're following the crowd. I find less and less real leadership. I find more people who look at the polls, see what's popular, and then lead in that direction. That's not leadership. You're following. If you're asking the poll what is right, here's the thing. I'm looking for people to get up and say, I understand the moral principles and what is right, and I'm going to lead us in that direction. That's what I'm looking for. Guess what? That's hard to find today. You find a lot of people who are like people, like priests. It's literally the spiritual leadership following what the people want rather than giving them what God would have them get. And so the number one thing I hear go to anything that's church growth and you will hear the same thing. Well, this is what people want. This is what they're willing to do. You need to shorten those messages because those people just are not going to tolerate that. It needs to be much more emotionally based because people are just, and I'm not saying that everything is bad that is new. I'm saying that leadership is leading, not taking polls and figuring out what people want. That's not leadership. Now, what's interesting is verse 10, it goes on and says this, they will eat but not have enough. They will play the harlot but not increase because they have stopped giving heed to the Lord. It's interesting. Family and physical security will fleet away as their relationship with me slips away. He says they will be unfulfilled in everything that they want. Supplies, security of their children. When they leave their walk with me, they're going to find that they work harder and get less. Then it goes on and he says in verse 11, harlotry, wine, new wine, take away the understanding. You know what he's saying? People can't deal with reality, so they do more to entertain themselves or anesthetize themselves. It gets harder and they just can't deal with it. So I can't deal with this, and they'll take a pill or take a drink. And literally what they find is no lasting peace and trying drugs and trying various kinds of people relationships. They won't find comfort in what they're doing. They'll have to try something else. I think people are stressed at an all-time breaking point, and I think that they're having trouble settling down. And part of the reason is because we've created in our society a number of blatant, ungodly practices that we've just allowed. And once you allow them, you unleash Pandora's box, and all of a sudden you have people working like crazy in a high level of stress. What's interesting is, get down to verse 12 and 13. It says, "My people consult their wooden idol, and their diviner's wand informs them. For a spirit of harlotry has led them astray, and they have played the harlot, departing from their God. They offer sacrifices on the tops of mountains and burn incense on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery." He's actually doing a little play on words here, because many of the high places were fertility gods and goddesses. And so there was a sexual activity that was part of the actual worship, if I can use the word worship. But he's not talking about that. He's playing with the image and saying spiritual adultery is what he's talking about. So let me put it this way. Your truth is dying. You're going to reinvent righteousness, and you're going to run around trying to make your own standards. Look, guys, there's really only two choices. There's a cosmogony that says there's a God who created everything and he knows what he wants, and we do that, or there isn't, in which case we have to create authority because there's no authority given us from above. If there's no authority given us from above, we have to make up morality, and we have to tell you why there's a good reason why you should do it. That's the modern man's problem. Without a God, there's a vacuum. And in that vacuum, what makes good good or right right? Why should I do what you have to say? What you think is good is not what I think is good. So why don't we just change the rules of good every few years, which is exactly what you're watching. You're going to grow up with certain principles that are absolutely right until all of a sudden they're unpopular, then they're absolutely wrong. How did good go to bad that fast? And he says, listen, in verse 14, I'm going to allow sin to go unpunished and unrighteousness to fill the land with loyalty left trampled underfoot. He says, look, I will not punish your daughters when they play the harlot, or your brides when they commit adultery. God says one of the greatest punishments he can level against the land is not to punish people's wrong. That seems weird, doesn't it? In other words, let people get away with injustice, and just let injustice prevail, and it is one of the judgments against the land. And then in verses 15 to 18, it says, though you, Israel, play the harlot, do not let Judah become guilty. Do not go to Gilgal, Beit Aven, and take an oath, as the Lord lives. Don't run around using God words on your ungodliness. I don't want to hear it. He says, since Israel is stubborn, like a stubborn heifer, can the Lord now pasture them like a lamb in a large field? Can I treat you like you're actually ready to follow me when I know you're really not? That's what he's asking. I'm going to withdraw my word. I'm going to withdraw my testimony. I'm going to withdraw my truth because you're not listening to me anyway. Verse 17 says, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let them alone. Their liquor gone, they play the harlot continually. Their rulers dearly love shame. Underline, their rulers dearly love shame. You know what you're going to see? When people your eyes adjust to spiritual darkness. And when you get to the point where ungodliness looks right, people will walk around, leaders of a land will walk around and boast of shameful activities. I just want you to see how graphically stupid this is. This is leaders who are running around boasting about how they have broken the family. You will see them campaigning like that was a good thing. They're not going to be there to pick up the pieces of all the broken children, but they're going to let you know how they have opened the door to freedom. And one of the things I find interesting here is in particular, is it says in verse 19, the wind wraps them in its wings. Here I think what's interesting is that the word wind is ruach. It's the word for spirit or wind. It's the same word. The interesting thing about it to me is when people start down the road, public leaders start down the road of proclaiming immorality as right, what you find is that the wind whips up. People shower them with incredible popularity for stupid things. They'll get very excited about their, look at this person of freedom. That person of freedom stands for immoral positions all over the place. The thing that people don't remember is the other side of it. While that person, so for instance, a few years ago, I was overseas when President Clinton was president. You probably weren't even born yet. What happened was essentially he had an affair with a young girl. I mean, if that's, spoiler alert. Essentially he had an affair with a young girl, and it was interesting because in my part of the world, most people were shocked because they were not shocked that he had one. They were shocked that people cared. They were like, you mean all of your presidents didn't have mistresses? Because in many countries, that's just become the norm. And here's the thing. I think what happens is people forget that while that man is running around touting the fact that he has this young girl in his arm, there was a wife back home. There were children back home. That other people were affected, and nobody's talking about them. They're just talking about him like he can roll out this thing, and isn't it fashionable? We have sports players who have, boasted on air about the number of women they've slept with, and here's the thing they're not talking about. They're not talking about responsible behavior. They're talking about irresponsible behavior. So all I'm saying is when you look at this passage, God comes down and he says, I want you to understand that there are some penalties that are going to happen in your land, and they're happening because of the indictments of what I've leveled against you. Do you understand then? Chapter 4 is straight talk from a holy God, but it's exactly the same as the principles of judgment. In other words, it follows that same line. Now, chapter 5 then is going to explain the wrath of God in a very real way. When we talk about God's wrath, the word wrath actually comes from a word that is from the border or from a fence, avar. It's aleph, beit, resh. And the term avar is actually the word, it's a root word from which the Hebrews come. But the idea is this: the wrath of God is his consistent principles within which we are called to live. It's the fences of God. So, we used earlier in the year, I reminded you if you jump out of a 54th floor window on your way down, don't yell, "It's not fair," because it is. Gravity is part of the wrath of God. It's his consistent principles that bring about an effect to a cause. Don't jump off a roof and not expect to fall. In your whole lifetime, you have never floated, and you are not going to start that day. Okay? Consequently, if I take a dirty needle and I stick it into my epidermal organ, I will put inside my body things that weren't designed there and make myself sick. Why? Because of the wrath of God. The protective coating on me is to keep those things out. But when I violate his wrath, when I crash through his fence, I take on certain things because of it. In other words, I can say to you, there are diseases we get because of the wrath of God. It's not God's up in heaven and he's looking and goes, "There's one having fun, get him, zap." That's not what I mean. I mean, God says, I put a fence of protection, don't go through it. If you go through the fence of protection, there is a result. He who plays on highway gets run over. Okay? So there are certain protective things, and that's what is going to be brought out here. God's wrath wasn't designed to stop you from having fun. It was to stop you from killing yourself. As a society, that's part of what he wanted. We saw this in the law. Let's see if we can pick it apart. In verses 1 to 5, I want you to see that there's a certain kind of vacuum effect. What is God's wrath? How does it work to keep us right in a relationship with a holy God? Well, look at verses 1 to 5. It says, "Hear this, O priests, give heed, O house of Israel, listen, O house of the king, for the judgment applies to you, for you have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread out on Tabor. The revolters have gone deep in depravity, but I will chastise all of them. I know Ephraim, and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the harlot. Israel has defiled itself. Their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. Moreover, the pride of Israel testifies against him, and Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah has also stumbled with them. Here's what I want you to see. In verse 1, as the religious leaders go, so go the nation. Listen, priests, as the religious leaders go, so go the nation. But didn't we see in the last chapter, as the nation goes, so go the religious leaders? It's a vicious cycle. We raise those who lead us, and we follow them as leaders when they lead us in the wrong direction. The second thing I would tell you in verse 2, people will get a hunger for the externals without a solid relationship of a correct path, and they will fail to understand correction. He says, literally, the revolters have gone deep in depravity. At a certain point, a nation can't even pick out what's wrong when it's wrong. They can't see it anymore. Can you believe that a person can go so far into darkness that they can no longer see? You will meet people that will just look at you and they will laugh at the idea that you even think there is such a thing as sin, because they just don't see it. It's whatever you want to do, man. It's whatever you want to do. And they don't have any. That's depravity, the inability to see the moral rightness. Then it says in verse 3 that God has not withheld judgment because he's not seen it. He knows, he sees. In verse 3, he's not saying, I don't know. He says, I know, Ephraim, I see it. Do not get the idea that when God withholds judgment, it's because he doesn't see something. That's not true. You have never thought a thought God didn't see. Now, the interesting thing is in verse 4, it says there comes a time when people prefer the spiritual externals more than the truth. So he says, look, I want you to understand there's a snowball effect of a sin in a nation. That's what verse 5 is. The pride of Israel testifies against him. Israel, Ephraim stumble. Judah has also stumbled. There's a snowball effect. You know what I mean. That snowball going down the hill is growing as it's chasing you. As you allow in one nation sin to develop, it laps over into the next nation and the next and the next until it becomes very real. In the case of America, for instance, we have exported all kinds of immorality by virtue of our films and our music industry. We've pushed it all over the world to make sin normal. And isn't that wonderful? The same group of people that have paid for the bulk of Western missions has also paid for the bulk of Western immorality. And we're competing within ourselves and around the world. Now, there's a pronouncement. I want you to see in verses 6 through 15, this is what God will do. This is the pronouncement, what God will do. Okay, so we've seen the problem. This is what the people did. In verses 1 to 5, it's what the people did. In verses 6 through 15, it's what God's going to do. Here's God's answer. First, in verse 6, he's going to withdraw from the people. They will go with their flocks and their herds to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them. I want you to mark in your text, he has withdrawn from them. I want you to know that it is not ungodly to say, you push this past a certain point and God will withdraw. And you can look for him, you won't find him. It's not true to say that, no matter what you do, he will just always take you back. That's not true. That's not true. It's always possible he will, but do not walk around with the presumptive nature that you can tell God, listen, I'm still your child, so you still need to let me back at the last hour. You're really playing a dangerous game. In verse 7, in deception, people bear fruits of falseness, and God brings their system down on them. Look at verse 7. They have dealt treacherously against the Lord, for they have borne illegitimate children. Now the new moon will devour them within their land. He says, you need to understand that when you walk in deception over a long period of time, there's fruits of false things that come out of it, and eventually the whole system comes apart. In verse 8, judgment is sure. That's why he says, blow the horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, sound an alarm in Beth-aven. Behind you, Benjamin. He's trying to say, look, there's absolute, swift, sure judgment coming. Your borders have been breached by your own works. Your fences are coming apart. Here's what he's trying to say. Everybody worries about somebody attacking their nation. Yours is dying from the inside out. It's already dying. You're already allowing all this to happen, God says. And then he goes on and he says in verse 12, therefore I am like a moth to Ephraim and like rottenness to the house of Judah. A moth as in eating away at it. Our image would be termite. I'm like a termite eating the inside of your whole place. You've breached your own fences and you're allowing things to be eaten within. The rottenness would be like the disintegration of the house of Judah. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to King Yarib, but he is unable to heal you or to cure you of your wound. Look what happened. When a group of people who should have known God found that the things were getting worse, where did they go? The world system to prop up their system. Instead of coming back to God, they went to a better borrowing scheme, a new Wall Street scheme for economics. Instead of saying, why are we getting broken economically? Could it have anything to do with our sinfulness? They don't turn back to God, they turn toward the world. And Assyria becomes the representative of that. All right, now when you get down to, he falls through it, and he says in verse 14, I will be like a lion to Ephraim. In verse 15, I will go away and return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. He says, I'm just going to back up. I'm going to withdraw. And I will await one thing. What is the one thing in verse 15 God is waiting for? I will come near to you when you come near to me. When you acknowledge your guilt and seek my face, then I will come. Did you notice up above, though, he says they're going to seek me and not find me. What's the difference between up above when they're going to seek him and not find him and in verse 15? What's the first step? Repentance. It's when you are willing to admit you're wrong and change, then seek me that you can find me. If you seek me without repentance, I will not be found. There is a really important heartbeat to the book. And in chapter 6, I want you to mark chapter 6 and cut it into a couple of pieces. In 6:1-3, there's a call of the prophet. In 1-3. In 4-11a, to the first half of 11, 4-11a, there's the works of the people. And then in 11b, all the way through 7:3, the cry of the Father. And then we're going to move, while we're doing this, let's follow through. 4-7 is an example. There's 4 examples. Example number 1 is an oven. In 7:8-10, it's a cake that's burned on one side. A burnt cake. And in verses 11-15, 7:11-15, lost pigeons. Lost homing pigeons. Homing pigeons that can't go home.
Is that example 3?
That's example 3. And example 4 in 7:16 is a, I don't know how to say it, an unreliable bow. It's a bow and arrow set, but the bow's bent. A bent bow. That's pretty good, a bent bow. But then you're going to think it's bent properly. It's an improperly bent bow. Okay, first let's start with the call of the prophet. There are 2 calls in the first 3 verses. Come, let us return to the Lord. That's call number 1. In 2 words, turn back. And in verse 3, let us press on to know the Lord, is the word let us gaze on the Lord. The first one is let's go back to him. The second one is let's gaze. God will surely return to us if we gaze upon him. Okay? Those are your 2 calls. What is he asking the people to do? This is not a trick. It's not rocket science. What's he asking them to do?
Turn away from evil, head back towards him.
Yeah, come back to the Lord, and let's really spend some time focusing on who the Lord is. At the heartbeat of dealing with a sinful heart, spend time focusing on who God is, not what sin is. I said that too quickly. If you find yourself in a place where you, for whatever reason, become passionless in your walk, The issue isn't beat yourself up about all your sin. That's not the right way back. The right way back is fix your eyes on the Savior. Fix your eyes on the Lord. Spend some time exploring His goodness. It'll draw your heart back where it goes. Does that make sense? You can sit around and feel bad about the stuff you did wrong, or you can focus on Him and the sweetness of God, and that will draw you back to where you need to be. I think that's where he's going. He's using terms like gaze because he wants you to really spend some time thinking about who is the Lord? Who is this one that I'm serving? I have done a miserable job serving you, but I need to spend more time thinking about how do I serve you? How do I become what you want me to become and walk with you as I should? Okay, in verses 4 to 11, look at the works of the people. I'm not going to spend a long time here because you've heard all this stuff before with the condemnation. Let me just pick out some. In verse 4, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? For your loyalty is like the morning cloud. What's the morning cloud? Like the dew which goes away early. What's he saying?
Disappears.
You have the most evaporating love ever. Your commitment is like as thin as dew that by 9 o'clock in the morning is gone. Like you are like, I will be with you forever. It's like that person you fell in love with at camp and you swore your heart and you were going to write them every day the rest of your life, and the second week you couldn't get a letter off. I mean, hello, you don't stick with anything. But I think he's saying in verse 6, I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice. Your outward work replaced your heart. I delight in loyalty, not sacrifice. Or in verse 7, your heart strayed into unfaithfulness. Like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. You can't stick with anything. You could pick up the violence in verse 8, or the greed in verse 9, or the idols in verse 10, or the judgment that they stored up in verse 11. The basic point is the same, though. The basic point is you have evaporated in terms of any kind of commitment to me, and I really see exactly who you are. The second half of verse 11 is where I want you to drop your eyes. When I restore the fortunes of my people, can you hear the wind shift? You're bad, you're violent, you're greedy. When I restore the fortunes of my people, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is uncovered, and the evil deeds of Samaria, for they deal falsely. The thief enters in, bandits raid outside. They do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their deeds are all around them. They are before my face. With their wickedness, they make the king glad and the princes with their lies. He says, listen, I feel totally ripped off. That's why verses 11b through 7:3 are the cry of the Father. I feel utterly ripped off. When I want to reach out to you, you cheat me out of blessing. How does that happen? How does the sin of Israel cheat God out of blessing? It's the best thing I can tell you is that my kids did this to me. I have felt this 1,000 times when my kids were growing up. You know, I wanted to take them out on a hot night, go get ice cream. I wanted to do that because I wanted to be like the cool dad, you know? And then they would misbehave and get into a fight. Now I can't take you. Because if I take you, it's going to be like what you did was okay and what you did wasn't okay. So now you ripped me off of being able to be the coolest dad ever to do this for you. Now I'm sitting at home when I wanted to go and wanted to have a good time with my family, and instead I'm having to spank kids and send them to bed early, and this is not fun for me. That's kind of the ripped off feeling God has. Now, the second part of it is not only that he feels ripped off, like I get that in like the 11, in 1, in 2, but in verse 3, I really think I feel trashed because you flaunt your sin in front of your leaders. I feel like you're just willing to do anything you want to do, and I feel trashed as your God. I want you to get the sense of God's feeling, and then he says, okay, maybe this isn't touching you. Maybe what I need are some pictures. So let's bring out the pictures. Okay, now we've got the cartoons coming out. And the first one is in verses 4 to 7. He says, these are examples of deceit. This is how God sees it. So look at verse 4. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. Now, this is really a hot image. I mean, you are right on top of this one, right? No, not so much. First of all, most of you don't bake. Second, if you did, it's in an oven that you turn a knob, not that you stoke up coals for. I want you to imagine this is a taboon. It's like an oven that has like a big dome on it. Have you ever gone into a place that made like wood-fired pizza? Okay, that's the kind of oven he's talking about. So you actually stack the wood in the back, you burn it, you get coals, you shovel them back, and then you put the pizza in it, right? Or in this case, the bread or whatever. So he says, you're adulterers. You're cheaters. I would just use the word cheater. You're a cheater. You're like the oven that the baker heated up, but then he wasn't stirring it or tending to the fire anymore to keep it hot. Instead, he went over and started kneading the dough and left the fire go. Now, watch what he says. On the day of our king, the princes became sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers, for their hearts are like an oven. They approach their plotting. Their anger smolders at night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. All of them are like a hot oven, and they consume their rulers, and all their kings have fallen. None of them calls me. None of them calls on me. What is the basic idea of the unstirred fire in the oven? What's he trying to say? It's poetic, so some of you are going, what's the idea? The words I use are hot and ready sin. Okay? I think you're willing to stoke up the fires, to not tend things, the appropriate things, and to allow, I guess there's not really an easy way for me to say this. You let the people who should be leading the nation drift, and you let the passion of the nation drift, and you allow it rather to be a hot fire to do wrong rather than a hot fire to have passion. Maybe that's the way to say it. Go to the second one, see if this one's any easier. Ephraim, verse 8, mixes himself with the nations. Ephraim has become like a cake not turned. And what I mean is when you have an oven like that, you have to turn it where you burn one side gets burned, the other side is still raw, okay? Strangers devour his strength, yet he does not know it. Gray hairs are sprinkled on him, yet he does not know it. Though the pride of Israel testifies against him, yet they have not returned to the Lord their God, nor have they sought him for all of this. It's almost like they're blind victims. They don't seem to understand what's happening to them. Things are getting worse and they don't see it because only part of them are actually feeling the heat and the other part isn't. Does that make sense? I know these are hard images. Try the third one. Maybe the third one will be a little easier because all the images are to say the same thing. Deceitfulness. You're not honest. You're not straight. You're not actually doing what you should do. Look at verses 11 to 15. So Ephraim has become like a silly dove. Okay, I would say a lost homing pigeon. Okay, silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt. They go to Assyria. In other words, they're flitting all over the place. They're going after help wherever they can. When they go, I will spread my net over them. I will bring them down like birds of the sky. I will chastise them in accordance with the proclamation to their assembly. Woe to them, for they have strayed from me. Destruction is theirs, for they have rebelled against me. I would redeem them, but they speak lies against me. And they do not cry to me from their heart. When they wail on their beds for the sake of their grain and new wine, they assemble themselves. They turn away from me. Although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. He says, listen, the more you look for help in the world, the more directionless and purposeless you become. If you would call to me, I'd bring you home. You can't get home because you're so busy running all over the place with no direction, no purpose, and no sense of who you are. And then the last one is you're like an unreliable weapon. Verse 16, they turn but not upward. They're like a deceitful bow. What does that mean? They turn but not upward. They look for solutions in every direction possible except for his direction. That's the one place they won't look. Their princes will fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This will be their derision in the land of Egypt. He says, look, I'm trying to show you, you guys are like directionless, purposeless, useless, blind, hot and ready for sin, but not ready for a passionate walk with me. You've totally lost what I gave you. And I'm trying to turn to you and tell you exactly what you are, but it doesn't even make sense the way you're acting.